There are mornings on the lake when the world seems to breathe in slow motion, when mist drifts over the water like a wandering spirit and the pines stand as still as sentinels. On those mornings, peace feels earned, a borrowed luxury granted only to those who know how fragile it truly is. And yet, even on a morning carved from quiet, trouble found its way back down my dock, carried by the click of relentless heels and the rustle of paperwork wielded like a weapon. You'd think the HOA would have learned by now not to provoke a man whose family owned the very water they strutted across. But rules and reason rarely held sway over someone like Sophie Ward. She came marching down the dock as if she commanded a battalion, her sunglasses gleaming, clipboard clutched with conviction, and a tow truck trailing behind her like a reluctant accomplice. The tow driver looked as though he wished he could dissolve into the lake mist itself. Even from my porch, coffee steaming between my palms, I could feel the tension radiating off him. Sophie treated the shoreline like a stage and herself as the sole performer. Her gestures chopped through the air, her posture stiff with the kind of self-awarded authority only an HOA president believes is absolute. She pointed at my boat, the vessel that had been anchored in the same place for decades, and began directing the driver with the fervor of someone staging a public spectacle. The chain rattled, the tow truck hissed, and then chaos struck with the timing of a slapstick tragedy. One of Sophie's board members, overly eager to impress her, misjudged a step and plunged straight into the shallows. The splash echoed across the cove like a drumbeat announcing her humiliation. Laughter rippled through the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered with the instinctive curiosity of people sensing impending disaster. Even the lake seemed amused, tossing small ripples across the surface that glimmered like smothered chuckles. Sophie's face flashed from ivory to crimson. In a desperate attempt to salvage control, she tore an orange violation sticker from her clipboard and slapped it onto the hull of my boat, only for the damp morning air to peel it loose and drop it neatly onto the toe of her own shoe. It was at that exact moment that my brother, Sheriff Tom, pulled up. His cruiser eased beside the dock like a metronome finding tempo. He stepped out slow, scanning the situation with the calm of a man who had seen small-town drama bloom into wildfire more times than he could count. He didn't need words to dismantle her performance. The tilt of his hat and the weight of his silence were enough to expose every gap in her crusade. She had no paperwork, no authority, no jurisdiction. As she fumbled, the laughter grew. But beneath the humor, beneath the absurdity, something deeper stirred. A realization that this wasn't just another petty attempt to control porch lights or lawn heights. This was an incursion, a trespass, the beginning of something larger. I could feel it in the air, sharp as cold pine and old stone. Because they weren't just hassling a man with a boat. They were standing on my lake. And that meant the reckoning had already begun. The morning light carried the scent of cedar and damp earth, a reminder of the generations who had walked this land before me. The lake lay spread out like a mirrored sheet of pewter, soft ripples catching the sun and scattering light in every direction. This place had raised me, held me, steadied me. Peace wasn't accidental here. It was inherited, protected, etched into the geography like a promise. Most mornings I stood on the porch rail, chipped blue mug in hand, listening to the quiet symphony that carried across the water, the hum of old boat motors warming up, the splash of trout turning circles beneath the surface, the murmured conversations of anglers comparing weather and hope. Neighborhood kids clattered down the dock in neon vests, faces full of anticipation and summer freedom. Old-timers settled into creaking chairs with the familiarity of men whose stories were braided into the lake's memory. None of them had ever paid to be here. They just came. And in return for respect, simple, unspoken, stewardly respect, the lake welcomed them. My grandfather made that promise long before I was born. And when the lake became mine, the promise became a legacy I was determined to keep. Sophie Ward never understood that kind of inheritance, the kind you don't measure by bylaws or budgets, but by the lives that unfold quietly on a shoreline. She lived in a world that revolved around memos, fines, and the illusion of authority. Her power was ink on paper, clipped together by enthusiasm and a belief that titles could compensate for experience. She believed control came from a crisp blazer and the sound of heels tapping across a dock. But the lake didn't recognize her wardrobe. The water didn't bow to clipboards or committees. It only responded to those who tended it, protected it, understood it. My grandfather taught me that the lake remembers everything. Not in words, but in small echoes. The way storms reshape the shoreline, the way old stumps grip forgotten anchors, the way ice bends and groans beneath careless steps. He had shown me the truth the day he walked me to the boundary marker at North Cove, where granite ribs emerged from the soil like ancient bones. He had handed me an envelope and told me I wouldn't need it until I did. Paperwork, he'd said, could be used to confuse the simple-minded. But land, water, and history, those don't bend to ambition. They outlast it. That envelope now lived in the same drawer as the deed, the surveys, and the chain of title, a collection of documents older than most of the houses in this neighborhood. Their ink smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. They detailed everything from riparian rights to shoreline elevations, from the first fisherman's shack to the cabin that grew into a home. And every time I opened that drawer, I felt the weight of responsibility humming beneath my fingertips. For decades, being a steward of this lake had been simple. I fixed motors, lent paddles, hauled trash barrels, set stumps free from snagged anchors. The community existed on goodwill. But a handful of homeowners had formed a neighborhood association years ago, harmless at first, focused on plow schedules and seasonal landscaping. I paid it little mind. Until Sophie arrived. Until the association evolved into something with teeth. Until the bylaws stretched their reach like invasive vines. Her rise was quiet at first, newsletters about mailbox paint, reminders about porch light styles, subtle nudges toward uniformity. Then fines crept in like storm clouds on a windless day. Lawn height violations. Porch chair citations. Children's toys deemed unacceptable visual clutter. Each rule justified by an aesthetic she alone interpreted. People grumbled. Some paid. Most stayed silent. That silence was her fuel. But the moment her letters arrived in my mailbox, first generic, then accusatory, I knew she had begun circling territory she didn't understand. She suggested a shared shoreline management plan, which read less like cooperation and more like annexation disguised in polite fonts. I didn't laugh at those letters. Kept them. And I started keeping notes of my own. Dates, names, weather conditions, every shift from suggestion to demand. Paper meets paper. That's how you prepare for the kind of confrontation Sophie was unknowingly provoking. Neighbors soon found their way to my porch. They came with frustrations disguised as small talk, complaints about measurements taken without permission, threats issued without cause, warnings taped to fences, violations that felt more like harassment than governance. I asked for copies, screenshots, anything tangible. Not to weaponize, but to anchor the truth. Because you don't fight hornets by swatting. You plan. You observe. You move the hive when the time is right. So while Sophie built her empire of notices and bylaws, I gathered the tools that mattered: certified deeds, historical surveys, boundary filings. I charted the HOA's stated borders against its legal ones. A dotted line on a map held no power against land that had been measured, recorded, and witnessed generations before Sophie ever imagined herself queen of anything. Then the banker called. A man with a voice brittle as old glass. He asked if I knew anything about the Marina's debt, a note slipping dangerously close to default. The Marina, with its mismatched docks and its desperate attempt to resemble a yacht club, had been a controversial project for years. And now it was becoming a liability. He wondered if I knew any interested parties. I did. I just hadn't planned to be one until that moment. Because tucked inside the Marina's paperwork was something I remembered only vaguely, a right of first refusal tied to a riparian easement negotiated by my grandfather when the Marina was nothing more than 3 slips and a soda machine. That clause was a time capsule waiting to be opened, a quiet reminder that every overreach eventually meets its boundary. And so I studied. I traced maps, read clauses, sharpened pencils, and took long, slow breaths while the lake whispered against the shore. I called Grace Holloway, the lawyer who knew the value of commas and patience. And piece by piece, the picture became clear. I had leverage. Real leverage. Not to punish, but to restore balance where Sophie had tried to disrupt it. All the while, neighbors grew bolder. Kids asked questions. Old-timers offered quiet nods. Even the canoe teenager paddled by one afternoon and asked whether the HOA could make rules for water. I told him the only truth I knew, that water remembers. And if you write the truth down and keep it safe, the law remembers too. Then Sophie escalated. The emails multiplied, each one more frantic than the last. Claims that my dock obstructed communal visibility. Assertions that my boat spoiled subdivision values. Complaints rooted not in law but in ego. Values, she called them. As if courtesy and restraint weren't values written into the heart of this community long before she arrived. So I replied once, a brief reminder of where her jurisdiction ended. And then I let silence do the rest. She didn't like silence. Silence made her loud. Which is why she arrived again with a tow truck, a crowd, and a determination born of wounded pride. She marched toward my dock, flanked by Carl Jenkins and Deborah Ross, two people stitched from the same cloth, bound by shared indignation and a devotion to rules that had drifted far from reason. Sophie's reinforcements. Her attempt at reclaiming control. Her declaration of a battle she didn't know she'd already lost. The neighborhood gathered again, drawn by the tension rising off the dock like heat waves. Mark, the tow truck driver, looked defeated before he even climbed out of the cab. The truck itself seemed to sag under the weight of collective embarrassment. Sophie advanced, posture taut, clipboard raised like a shield. She demanded cooperation, invoked bylaws, referenced non-existent clauses. Her confidence cracked each time she flipped a page in that binder and found nothing but paper and panic. The crowd murmured. The lake shimmered. The sky seemed to hold its breath. Her temper simmered. Her composure faltered. Her certainty collapsed. And still she pushed forward, insisting on authority where she had none. Neighbors watched with barely contained amusement, but beneath their laughter was the awareness that something was shifting, that her empire of paper was crumbling in front of the one person she could never afford to provoke. Because while she dealt in notices and threats, I dealt in deeds and history. And the lake remembers. As she barked for the tow truck to proceed, as the crowd leaned closer, as the sunlight sharpened across the rippling water, I realized something simple and profound. This wasn't the climax. This was only the beginning. Her downfall hadn't started with a sticker on a shoe. It started the moment she stepped onto a dock she didn't own. And the lake, patient as always, was about to remind her of the truth. After all, what happens when someone who believes they control everything discovers they control nothing at all? The chain slipped from Mark's hands with a defeated rattle, scattering across the dock like a metal serpent finally losing its purpose. The morning sun caught on each steel link, painting thin glimmers across the planks, as though even the light was tired of this pointless spectacle. Mark's shoulders sagged in the kind of resignation that comes only after realizing you've been conscripted into someone else's ego parade. But before the quiet could settle, a low, familiar rumble drifted down the gravel road, heavy, unhurried, unmistakable. Sheriff Tom's cruiser rolled into view again, sunlight glinting along the windshield like some cosmic spotlight aimed straight at the absurdity unfolding by the water. The vehicle eased to a stop with the calm certainty of a man who already knew this performance by heart. Tom stepped out, hat tilted just enough to signal he wasn't here for trouble, hands resting casually on his belt like he was arriving at the encore of a comedy show he never agreed to attend. His gaze slid across the dock, catching the tension, sniffing out the frayed tempers, but mostly registering Sophie's posture, rigid, trembling, already coiled too tight to unwind. And she went straight for him, desperate for the kind of authority she thought she could borrow instead of earn. She gestured toward the boat, toward the dock, toward anything that might validate the power she was so desperate to wield. She insisted she was performing a lawful removal, citing HOA codes like sacred scripture. Tom blinked slowly, the way a man blinks when he's trying not to laugh in church. He reminded her, plainly, calmly, that this was private property, that she and her entourage were trespassing yet again. But Sophie's indignation was an engine running on fumes of pride, and she wasn't about to let facts get in the way of her crusade. She tried to twist the words, reshape reality to suit her authority, but the dock remained stubbornly unpersuaded. Behind her, neighbors filmed the scene with phones shimmering like dragonfly wings in the sun. Even the lake seemed amused, small ripples nudging the shoreline as if nature itself was rolling its eyes. Mark muttered something under his breath, letting the chain fall fully from his grip. The metallic clatter rang out like a punchline. Even I couldn't help the faint laugh rising in my chest, an involuntary exhale of disbelief at the sheer theatricality of it all. Sophie, refusing to surrender embarrassment, shoved another violation sticker toward my boat. The waxy surface rejected her again, and the sticker slid helplessly down, landing squarely on the toe of her pristine heel. The crowd erupted. Even the gulls circling overhead seemed to mock her misfortune, letting out sharp, echoing cries that pierced through the rising laughter. Her lieutenants hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to assist her or pretend they didn't see. The human instinct to self-preserve is funny like that. Nobody wants to be within arm's reach of someone melting down in public. Tom stepped forward then, the humor draining from his face. His voice deepened, firm with the weight of an officer who'd given more warnings than anyone deserved. He laid out the final line in the sand: no more trespassing, no more tow trucks, no more invented authority masquerading as law. For a moment, Sophie's expression cracked. Pride is a brittle material, and when it splinters, the pieces are sharp enough to cut the person holding them. She straightened her blazer, lifted her chin, and left with a promise that dripped more venom than conviction. The moment her heels clacked angrily up the dock, the crowd exploded. Cheers shook the planks. Someone played dramatic trumpet notes on their phone. It felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like the ending of a circus, the kind where everyone knows the ringleader is the only one who doesn't realize the show is over. When the noise died down, I asked neighbors to save their footage, every angle, every second. Not out of spite but out of preparedness. In a world run by tired rules and louder opinions, evidence is the closest thing to armor. Tom stayed behind with me. As the crowd dispersed, he reminded me that Sophie wasn't the type to cut her losses. People like her treat defeat like a dress rehearsal. They always think the real performance is still ahead. I nodded, understanding far more than I wished I did. That evening, the lake settled under a shifting sky. A thin scent of rain crept in through the window screens of my cabin. The ceiling fan rotated lazily overhead, its slow rhythm turning the air into a steady hum of calm. I sat at the table, spreading out copies of every photo, every letter, every map. Evidence layered thick in a manila folder that I labeled with deliberate ceremony: Lake Sanders Evidence File. The act of preparing wasn't driven by anger. Anger is chaotic, impulsive. What I felt was something sharper, quieter: resolve. Justice doesn't rush. It waits. It weighs. It endures. And over the next few days, I watched the storm shift from the dock to the digital world. Kids made TikToks of Sophie's sticker mishaps. Someone remixed her commands into a techno beat that echoed through the local bar. Even the HOA posted a warning about false narratives, which only stoked the fire further. The more they tried to control the story, the wilder it became. But I stayed silent. When you're truly prepared, you don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to match chaos with chaos. You just collect, compile, and wait. By midweek, Sophie's tone changed online. Her Facebook post insisted that misinformation was being spread and that legal counsel had been retained. It read more like a bluff than a threat, an empty stage declaration made by someone hoping the audience wouldn't notice the backdrop was cardboard. But I didn't underestimate her. Pride has a way of digging deeper rather than walking away. So I kept strengthening my foundation. I visited the county recorder's office, confirming again that the HOA boundary ended far from my dock. Notarized. Filed. On my way out, my attorney friend Grace spotted me, recognizing the thick envelope tucked under my arm. She gave me the same reminder she always did: paper beats noise. And she wasn't wrong. In a world where people shout their truth, the stamped documents usually win. That night, thunder rolled across the lake, heavy and slow. I reread my grandfather's deed, the one with his handwriting fading along the margins. Hold in stewardship, not in fear. Those words struck deeper than I expected. This wasn't just a fight over property lines or some misguided HOA obsession. This was legacy, memory, heritage. People like Sophie fight for power. People like my grandfather lived for meaning. And as the storm tapered off, I knew the next chapter was already forming, inevitable as sunrise. By the weekend, the air felt different. Restless. Even the geese seemed uneasy, drifting across the water in jittery formations. Nature warns you when imbalance approaches, and that morning, the lake felt like it was holding its breath. At exactly 7 minutes past 9, peace shattered. An SUV rolled down the slope with theatrical precision. The doors opened in coordinated succession, and out stepped Sophie again, only this time with reinforcements. She carried herself like a monarch returning to reclaim a stolen throne. Trailing behind her were 2 HOA board members in matching polos, a cameraman with a shoulder rig, and a man dressed in an ill-fitting navy suit who clutched a briefcase like it was a sacred artifact. The poor guy looked like he'd been yanked from some downtown office and told he'd be starring in a courtroom drama. Instead, he'd landed in an HOA meltdown by the lake. Neighbors emerged like spectators drawn by distant thunder. Phones lifted. Whispered commentary spread across the shoreline. It felt like déjà vu, but with higher stakes, worse decisions, and more cameras. The suit man, Robert Clean, tried to project authority, but sweat already beaded along his brow. He raised his papers, shuffling them with the trembling commitment of someone who wasn't sure why he was here but knew he was being paid too little for it. He rattled off code numbers, restrictions, and aesthetic clauses with the shaky pride of a student presenting a project he didn't understand. Sophie backed him up, doubling down on the idea that my boat somehow obstructed community views and disrupted neighborhood harmony. The crowd snickered. But I had been waiting for this exact moment. The moment she publicly, confidently, fatally overreached. I stepped up, calm as the still water beside us, and let her declare it again on camera, for every witness present, that the HOA had jurisdiction over the lake. The words echoed across the water, and sealed her fate. Because just then, the sound of tires crunching gravel broke through the murmurs. A white van approached, marked with the blue stripes of the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary. 4 officers stepped out. The energy on the dock shifted instantly. Gasps rippled. Phones zoomed. Sophie's confident posture fractured. The Coast Guard explained they'd received a report of an unauthorized maritime seizure attempt. Their tone was professional, but the subtext was unmistakable. They weren't here for me. They were here because of her claims. Neighbors erupted with whispered disbelief, laughter, shock. The officers reviewed my paperwork, then looked through Sophie's binder, where loose pages printed from the HOA website fluttered uselessly, none carrying legal authority. One officer compared her claims of jurisdiction to trying to regulate the moon. The dock shook with laughter. Cameras shook with it. A gust of wind scattered part of Sophie's binder into the lake. Kids retrieved pages with sticks, reading the nonsense aloud. It devolved into pure spectacle. Half sitcom, half documentary, all disaster. And I didn't need to celebrate. I didn't need to revel in her humiliation. The truth was doing the work on its own. The Coast Guard confirmed my rights. Confirmed the boundary lines. Confirmed the HOA held no authority here. When they left, the applause was tidal, rolling across the lake, echoing off every porch. Sophie tried to leave with dignity, but wet sols and steep hills rarely cooperate with pride. She stumbled in front of dozens of cameras, becoming an instant viral sensation. By nightfall, the internet had named her the HOA lady who tried to evict the Coast Guard. Memes spread. Jokes multiplied. Even local businesses joined the parade. But behind all the humor, behind the catharsis, behind the sudden collapse of HOA, something darker simmered. Because mockery doesn't extinguish people like Sophie. It ignites them. And I could feel it, quiet as pressure behind a dam, waiting for its moment to crack. After all, how long can pride survive before it turns into something far more dangerous? What storm was she preparing next, and would the lake warn me in time? Late Tuesday night, the lake slept under a sheet of silver moonlight, but my phone refused to rest. Its vibration cut through the stillness like a warning tremor before a quake. On the screen, a single notification glowed from a trusted contact at the local bank, the same institution clutching the Marina's mortgage note like a lifeline. The message was short, almost casual, but loaded enough to shift the current beneath everything we'd endured so far. Someone had tried to renegotiate the HOA's loan terms. A woman named Ward. The moonlight washed across the deed framed above my desk, illuminating its edges like an omen. I leaned back, realizing she'd finally taken her ambitions into deeper, far more dangerous water. Let her scribble her name across the margins of a debt she didn't understand. Every signature she added only wove another thread into her own noose. By Thursday, escrow closed. Final. Irrevocable. My newly formed LLC snapped the Marina's mortgage note out of the bank's hands like a shark taking a fish from shallow waters. And just like that, I controlled the debt tethered to the HOA's most prized possession, the Marina, the jewel of their little empire, the pulpit Sophie had preached from for years. The irony tasted almost sweet. The next time she strutted across the docks, chin high and ego burning, she'd be standing on land tied financially to me. Land her HOA now owed debt on. Money they didn't have. Money they'd never be able to justify. And the best part, she didn't know yet. She was still out there giving speeches and waving papers, blissfully unaware that the ground under her heels was shifting grain by grain. I sat outside that evening with Tom, the sun dripping fiery gold across the lake surface, painting every ripple in molten light. We clinked bottles, the soft thud of glass echoing between us like familiar punctuation. The first cool hints of autumn carried the smell of pine and distant chimney smoke. Perfect. Deceptively calm. My grandfather's old saying drifted through my mind, the calmest water hides the deepest current. A truth he'd learned from storms, from life, from the hard lessons of land and lake. And it was true now more than ever. The deeper movements were already stirring beneath the surface, slow and unstoppable. Sophie wasn't swimming anymore. She was flailing in a current shaped by her own arrogance. You could feel the tension days before it broke. Thick, rolling across the lake like heat shimmering off asphalt. The entire town felt it, neighbors whispering on porches, local forums buzzing, a community collectively bracing for the next spectacle. Memes mocking the HOA still flooded the internet like confetti. Their reputation was bruised beyond repair. And Sophie Ward, she wasn't just desperate. She was unraveling. On Thursday night, glossy flyers began appearing in mailboxes, printed in screaming red ink, promising a community emergency meeting. A dramatic attempt to reclaim order. A battle cry disguised as civic duty. At the bottom sat her name, bold and trembling, hosted by Lakeview HOA President, Mrs. Sophie Ward. Anyone with a pulse could see it for what it was, pure theater. An overproduced PR stunt by someone who smelled smoke but insisted the house wasn't burning. But the timing was beautiful. Her grand rally, her attempt at a comeback tour, was scheduled for Saturday at noon. Right at the Marina. The Marina whose mortgage note I now owned under Blue Cedar Holdings. Her stage, her moment, her megaphone, all staged atop property tied to my ledger. The kind of irony Tom would have framed and hung proudly on his wall. Friday morning, I visited his office. He lounged back in his chair, boots perched on the desk, sipping coffee that smelled like burnt ambition. He asked if I really wanted to let Sophie proceed with her circus. Absolutely. You don't interrupt an actress during her monologue. You let the lights rise, the audience watch, the drama unfold. Only then does the curtain come crashing down. That evening, I made final preparations. The paperwork confirming ownership was neat, precise, indisputable. The sheriff's office verified and logged everything officially. And then, with a calm smile, I posted a notice on the community board. Community barbecue and lake celebration, Saturday at noon. Polite, simple, cheerful. No grand claims. No pointed words. Just enough suggestion to spark curiosity and confusion. And just enough timing to collide spectacularly with Sophie's rally. By Saturday morning, the lakefront looked like a festival ground. Folding chairs dotted the grass. Families carried coolers brimming with soda and ice. Children ran in loops with water guns gleaming in the sun. The smell of grilled ribs danced through the warm breeze, weaving with laughter and the strumming of a local band tuning their guitars beneath a shady canopy. It felt less like a neighborhood cookout and more like a declaration of joy, joy reclaimed from fear. Across the water, though, something very different moved. Sophie's convoy appeared on the horizon like a bad omen. 2 SUVs crammed with HOA board members, a car with a massive banner strapped to its side screaming "Reclaim our community waters," and trailing behind them, as expected, a news van she must have begged to attend. If she planned to resurrect her crown, she had chosen the stage, the costumes, and the cameras with desperate precision. She emerged with the brittle confidence of a queen whose kingdom had already revolted. Pink blazer bright enough to blind, wide hat casting a dramatic shadow, smile sharp enough to cut paper but fragile enough to snap under a feather's weight. Her voice blasted through a megaphone, slicing across the lake like a siren. Accusations poured out, claims of defiance, disorder, and one man threatening the harmony of an entire community. But her voice was immediately swallowed by a lively country riff from the band. The crowd clapped along, drowning her theatrics in joy. Her jaw tightened. The brittle edges of her performance began to crack. Tom, standing at the grill in uniform, lifted a rib like a baton of authority. The cameras swung helplessly between chaos and celebration, between the woman unraveling on one side and the communities laughing on the other. Guess which made better television? Still, she pushed forward, shouting about bylaws and aesthetics and shoreline sanctity, concepts she clung to like life rafts. Then she unfolded her masterpiece, a letter with a red seal and a lawyer's signature. Her supposed smoking gun. I stepped toward her, calm, steady, letting the cameras drink it all in. The document was a disaster of forged formatting and fake authority. The seal crooked. The language sloppy. The signature suspiciously familiar. When I flipped it over and revealed the words "template sample" on the back, the crowd erupted. Laughter rolled across the dock like thunder's playful cousin. Her face drained. Her certainty collapsed. A loud metallic clunk echoed behind her, the unmistakable clatter of a tow truck chain tightening. Mark Hill, cheerful as ever, hooked her illegally parked SUV without hesitation. The HOA banner flapped wildly like a flag surrendering against its will. The crowd chanted, stomping and cheering as the vehicle was tugged inch by inch away from her collapsing empire. When I raised the official deed and mortgage paperwork, the gasps hit like a wave. I owned the stage beneath her feet. I owned the dock she chose for her rally. And she had walked right into the spotlight of her own undoing. By sundown, local news had already crafted the perfect title: HOA President's Protest Implodes in Lakefront Meltdown. The clip went viral before Monday morning. Sophie sent one last desperate itchy email condemning lawbreakers. No one cared. Some residents replied with tow truck gifs. Others unsubscribed permanently. Her authority had dissolved. All that remained was noise. That night, Tom and I sat on the porch, watching the lake settle back into calm silver stillness. The Marina lights glowed like distant stars. Somewhere in the darkness, cicadas buzzed with offbeat rhythm. There was poetry in what had unfolded, the kind of poetic justice that didn't need words or applause. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't over. People like Sophie don't crumble quietly. They reload. And reload she did. Monday morning arrived crisp and sharp, the kind of morning that hinted at the first breath of fall. The lake was still. Too still. Sophie had been silent for 2 full days. A silence that felt less like surrender and more like strategy. By midweek, the silence broke. A letter appeared on my porch, hand-delivered, stamped with layers of faux importance. The threat. A lawsuit. Claims of unlawful possession, obstruction, harassment. Words thrown like darts by someone spinning blindfolded. I laughed, not out of arrogance but out of sheer disbelief. She really thought she could weaponize paperwork she didn't understand. Tom read it and nearly spit out his coffee. This was a spoon brought to a gunfight, a flimsy attempt to intimidate someone who spent weeks preparing for a war she didn't even know had begun. We didn't push back. We didn't escalate. We waited. 2 weeks later, the courthouse transformed into a coliseum. People filed in as if attending a championship game. Residents fined for mailbox colors. Fishermen scolded for quiet mornings. Business owners punished for imaginary violations. They came to witness the reckoning. They came to watch the tide turn. At the front, Sophie sat dressed like victory itself. Charcoal suit, rigid posture, stack of papers thick enough to fool someone from a distance. Beside her, a jittery lawyer who looked like he'd accepted this job out of sheer financial desperation. When the judge entered, recognition flickered in his eyes. Judge Whitaker, stern, seasoned, a man who once fished these waters with my grandfather. He struck the gavel, and the room fell silent. Sophie stood first, presenting her mountain of baseless claims. Her lawyer chimed in with misplaced confidence. But the judge saw through it immediately. Their documents were hollow. Their evidence non-existent. Their authority imaginary. Then my attorney, Grace, rolled forward a single box. One box. Neat, organized, fatal. Inside lay the true history of the lake. The chain of ownership. The surveys. The mortgage transfer. The legacy. When the judge reached the deed bearing my grandfather's signature, the decision was sealed. The lake belonged to the Sanders family. It always had. The HOA had no jurisdiction. No rights. No claim. The courtroom erupted with whispers. A collective exhale of justice finally met. Sophie's lawyer scrambled, desperate. His voice cracked as he shouted objection. The judge's gaze hardened. And then, silence. A silence sharp enough to cut through the room. A silence heavy with what came next. After everything Sophie had done, after every stunt, every lie, every desperate attempt to claw back power, what consequence was about to fall on her now? And how much deeper was she prepared to sink before she finally hit bottom? The judge's words cut through the courtroom like a cold blade, and the moment he delivered them, the atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a spectacle of accusation and flailing authority had transformed into something far heavier, a reckoning years in the making. He corrected Sophie with the steady calm of someone who had seen too many storms to fear a gust of wind. Bias wasn't acknowledging a familiar face, he implied. Bias was pretending photocopied fines could rewrite a century of legal history. The room rippled with laughter, a low rolling wave Sophie had no power to stop. Her composure cracked, her bravado dimming like a dying lantern. Grace continued presenting the evidence with the poise of someone unbothered by theatrics. Every document she laid on the table carried the weight of ages, tax records neatly preserved, plats marked with the precision of surveyors long buried, deeds inked by hands that built the lake's legacy before half the town had even existed. The judge followed each sheet with careful eyes, and every nod he gave was another nail in the coffin of the HOA's fantasy kingdom. When he finally turned to Sophie and asked if she disputed any of it, her face tightened into something small and cornered. She tossed out a desperate accusation about forged documents, waving her stack of unrelated fines like they were holy scripture. The courtroom roared. Even the bailiff looked moments away from smirking. Every ounce of power she thought she held evaporated in that single breath. The judge's voice grew colder as he warned her to watch her tone. But she couldn't stop herself. She spiraled, blaming everyone. The sheriff, the Coast Guard, the judge himself, anyone who had ever witnessed the truth she spent years trying to bury. It was the kind of unraveling that felt inevitable, like watching a bridge snap plank by plank. The gavel came down like thunder cracking across the lake. Dismissed with prejudice. Legal fees owed. Harassment noted. Jurisdiction revoked. The words echoed, reverberating in the wooden bones of the courthouse. And just like that, the war was over on paper, signed, stamped, sealed. The HOA's empire, built on intimidation and imaginary authority, collapsed in one clean strike. The room erupted, neighbors cheering as if a long winter had ended in a single sunrise. Even those who'd once feared Sophie let their shoulders drop, an entire community collectively exhaling after years of tension. Outside, the courthouse steps glowed under the afternoon sun as residents formed a crowd overflowing with relief. Reporters flocked around me, capturing a moment they knew would headline the evening broadcasts. The lake had become more than water. It had become a symbol of how power crumbles when built on sand. That night, the water was quiet again, reflecting the moon like a silver coin floating on ink. I sat on the porch, replaying the judge's ruling in my mind. Justice, when it arrives with clarity and force, feels like rain breaking a drought, relentless, cleansing, deeply overdue. But beneath the calm, I felt a flicker of something else. Relief, yes, but also certainty. Sophie wouldn't let humiliation be her final act. People like her didn't fade gracefully. They thrashed until every ounce of their pride was spent. And dawn proved me right. The morning of the eviction began with that rare kind of stillness that feels ceremonial. Mist drifted over the lake in pale ribbons, curling around the docks like the lake itself was waking up to witness what came next. By the time the sun climbed above the tree line, engines hummed softly in the distance. Tom arrived first, punctual as always. His cruiser rolled up the gravel drive with unhurried confidence, the red and blue lights spinning lazily, not to alarm but to affirm. Order had arrived. Balance. The kind that doesn't need noise to announce itself. Behind him, the deputies parked their own cruisers, followed by a Coast Guard boat easing toward the Marina. And trailing behind them, like a final gesture from the community itself, were families, neighbors, and longtime residents gathering along the shoreline. They weren't angry. They weren't vengeful. They simply wanted to bear witness to the end of an era that had overstayed its welcome. Tom handed me the official order, the judge's signature stamped proudly across the top. Every word on that paper was a clean break with years of tension. No more overreach. No more fines for mailbox colors or dock lighting or improperly enthusiastic barbecuing, as Sophie once called it. The lake was free again. Down at the Marina, the deputies unloaded boxes from the HOA's office, layers of relics from an age of petty tyranny. Laminated rule signs. Citation books. Red ink violation stickers. Every scrap of authority Sophie once wielded now sat stacked in the open air like fossils of a broken regime. The crowd grew, soft chatter swelling like a tide. Someone played music from a portable speaker. Someone else fired up a grill. Relief drifted through the air, warm as sunlight on water. But peace never lasted long around Sophie. Her voice broke the quiet like a jagged stone shattering glass. She stormed down the path with her pink blazer blazing against the green, gripping a folder to her chest as if it could shield her from what was about to happen. Behind her marched the last remnants of her board, faces hollow, hope abandoned long before they'd even left their cars. She shouted over everyone, declaring the gathering illegal, clinging to her shredded authority as though passion could replace power. The court order meant nothing to her. Facts meant nothing. She was the kind of person who believed volume could bend reality. Tom held the line with the calm steadiness of a man who'd seen every kind of meltdown the county could offer. The eviction order was clear. The HOA no longer had jurisdiction. And Sophie's reign ended the moment she stepped past the warning tape onto the dock. But she pushed forward anyway, anger rising, voice trembling with disbelief and denial. To her, this wasn't just a legal defeat. It was the collapse of an identity she'd built on fear and compliance. Without her rules, she was just another resident, something she could never accept. I walked toward her slowly, letting the calm morning light settle around the chaos she brought with her. The contrast almost felt poetic, her hurricane crashing against a shoreline that refused to move. Her rage sharpened when she saw me, spilling accusations, promises of appeals, threats of new lawsuits. But every word only echoed how powerless she'd become. The community wasn't listening. They were watching, observing her undo herself piece by piece. Even her own board members backed away. When Tom finally delivered the formal warning, vacate or face arrest, a tremor ran through her stance. For a moment, she teetered between pride and survival. Pride always fights hardest at the edge of a cliff. But survival won. The deputies stepped closer, and she wilted, retreating with a folder clutched to her chest like a fractured shield. Her final words drifted behind her like smoke. Threats, promises, declarations, none of them had the weight to carry. Her board followed in silence, their footsteps swallowed by the trees. The crowd watched them vanish with a mixture of disbelief and relief, as though witnessing the curtain drop after the final act of a long, exhausting play. With Sophie gone, the deputies began the symbolic finale everyone had come for. They stacked the HOA signs high on the dock, the warnings, the demands, the laminated rules that once dictated how people lived their lives. Every one of them a relic of control. And then, with the crowd holding its breath, the Coast Guard stepped forward with metal pails filled with lake water. As the water poured over the stack, ink bled like mascara in rain, dripping down the wood in dark streaks. Words that once carried threat and intimidation dissolved into nothing, absorbed back into the lake they had tried to control. The cheer that followed rose like a wave cresting under a summer sun. A little girl perched on her father's shoulders began chanting, "Freedom Lake," her voice shrill with joy. Within seconds, 100 voices joined in, filling the air with something that felt like rebirth. Music played. People clapped along. Relief spread through the crowd like a long-awaited breeze. And for the first time in years, the sound surrounding the dock wasn't tension, fear, or dictation. It was joy. It was release. It was the sound of a community reclaiming its breath. But beneath that celebration, an undercurrent still moved, slow, subtle, impossible to ignore. Because victories, even the sweetest ones, never end the story. Sometimes, they just open the door to the final chapter. And if there was one thing everyone could feel, beneath the laughter and music and sunlit water, it was this. Sophie Ward wasn't done. Not yet. The deeper the fall, the louder the splash, and hers was coming. Was the lake finally calm, or had we just stirred something waiting beneath the surface? The laughter carried across the water, lighter than the breeze but sharper than any courtroom gavel. I stood on the dock, the wood warm beneath my feet, watching a man approach, his steps hesitant, his polished blazer almost out of place among the splashing children and floating lanterns. Recognition struck instantly. One of the regional investors who had tried months earlier to acquire partial control of the HOA's water rights. The same man who had once imagined buying a piece of air and calling it legal territory. Now, nerves betrayed him. He carried a folder, perhaps hoping authority could be repackaged and sold one last time. But I raised a hand, and the world seemed to slow for just a heartbeat. There was no deal to discuss. Not here. Not now. The water he'd hoped to purchase, the rights he thought he could manipulate, were covered by a clause my grandfather had written decades ago. Right of first refusal. Every drop of this lake belonged first to the family who had cared for it. His gaze faltered, swallowing down embarrassment and panic at once. He nodded, the weight of defeat settling over him like fog, and walked away, briefcase swinging like a white flag surrendering to a summer storm. By noon, all the formalities had been completed. Deputies and the Coast Guard packed up their presents, their boats slicing the still surface of the lake one last time, leaving only clean, perfect ripples in their wake. Sheriff Tom flicked off the cruiser lights, giving the docks back to the people. He lingered for a moment, scanning the crowd of smiling faces, a wry grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. 30 years in law enforcement, and he had never seen a crowd cheer for paperwork before. But these weren't just papers. These were freedom written in ink and stamps and the long labor of the law finally bending to justice. The entire community had gathered, not out of obligation, but out of relief, joy, and something they hadn't felt in years, ownership of their own lives, if only symbolically, over the waters they had loved all along. That evening, the lake became alive again, pulsing with life and warmth. Strings of lights draped between trees glimmered in soft amber, painting a golden glow across the docks and lawns. Music drifted across the water, soft but steady, blending perfectly with the occasional splash of a child's laughter and the whisper of waves against boat hulls. Boats glided lazily in circular patterns, their reflections flickering like moving stars across the surface. Children chased fireflies, their fleeting lights bobbing over the reeds, while parents swapped stories of HOA absurdities, triumphs, and the strange sweetness of long-awaited revenge. Jim from the Yellow Ranch house raised a beer to me from across the water, and I shook my head at the gesture. No, we did it, I thought, because it was never a solo victory. It was communal, a story of the lake surviving the cruelty of bureaucracy, of people remembering how to reclaim what was theirs. Laughter rippled across the docks like a wave, gentle but unstoppable, a sound that replaced fear with a new kind of rhythm, relief, healing, and the quiet exhilaration of justice served. Later, as the music quieted and the laughter softened into the murmured contentment of neighbors gathering, I found myself alone on the dock. The pile of HOA signs had vanished, carried off by deputies earlier in the day, leaving only a single lantern glowing on the railing. The water beneath reflected the sky, smooth as glass, stars mirrored perfectly in the dark surface, dancing like tiny memories shimmering in the night. Tom joined me silently, standing shoulder to shoulder, both of us taking a moment to breathe in the calm we had fought for. I could see the question forming on his face before he spoke. Would she ever come back? I smiled faintly, the corners of my mouth lifting with a calm certainty. If she did, she would learn the hard way that this lake didn't forgive easily. It had memory, and its patience was long. Tom chuckled, a sound warm and grounded, and I glanced at the framed photograph of our grandfather we had brought down for the occasion. His half-smiling squint, the fishing rod in hand, knees in water, eternally calm and knowing. The wind shifted, carrying the faint strains of distant celebration, singing, conversation, the crackle of fire. The lake shimmered beneath the moonlight as though acknowledging its reclaimed peace. Real peace, I realized, doesn't announce itself with sound or spectacle. It hums quietly, carrying weight and meaning, enduring in ways chaos never could. Morning brought a new kind of serenity. The lake slept late, the surface smooth and unbroken except for the slow drift of a lone kayak, cutting a pale trail through the glassy water. Smoke from last night's barbecues lingered, soft and lingering in the air, carrying faint hints of cedar and toasted marshmallow. I sat on the porch, the same vantage point from which I had watched Sophie storm across the docks so many times before. But today, there were only natural sounds, the waddling of ducks, the distant bark of a dog, the gentle lapping of water against posts. The oppressive signs of control were gone, replaced by handmade flags planted by children along the shoreline. Crude, colorful, and heartful, they bore slogans like Freedom Lake, No More Fines, and We Love Carl's Dock. Even in their messy handwriting, they carried the pride and joy of a community rediscovering itself. My phone buzzed with a message from Tom, breaking the stillness. Laughter transmitted over the line. The county wanted to make it official. Lake Sanders on the record this time. I blinked in disbelief, the absurdity almost poetic. The lake, named for my family and protected by generations of care, was finally recognized as what it had always been, ours, forever anchored in law, memory, and love. My grandfather would have grinned so wide his pipe would have fallen, I thought quietly, and I felt the kind of gratitude that runs deep, almost sacred. Tom's voice carried a hint of nostalgia. Guess you finally finished what he started. I nodded, letting the reflection of the morning sun glittering on the water impress itself into my memory. The dock creaked beneath my feet as I walked toward the water, each step a measured reminder that this was a homecoming, a reclaiming, and a final bow after a long, absurd, beautiful play. Sunlight hit the lake at the perfect angle, turning the surface into molten gold. My reflection stared back, older, steadier, unshaken by the petty tyrannies that had once ruled here. There were no HOA enforcers, no threatening letters, no arbitrary fines. There was only life, ordinary and extraordinary, interwoven, families fishing again, pancakes on cabin stoves drifting on warm air, dogs chasing sticks, children skipping stones. Each splash punctuated the end of a sentence we had waited years to finish. Neighbors arrived intermittently, carrying gifts of tea, cookies, guitars, or just their presence. Together, we filled the space with laughter, music, and shared relief. The stories of fear and oppression, the fines and threats, faded in the presence of reclaimed joy. One neighbor remarked on the quiet we had almost forgotten, the normalcy of peace after years of constant headache, and the laughter that followed was different. Not mocking, not triumphal, but healing. I sat back, the dock warming beneath me, and thought about control. Funny thing about it, it only works when people forget they have the power to say no. And we had remembered. Linda strummed a few lazy chords, the soft melody wrapping around our conversation. "You could have kicked us all off too," she said quietly. I smiled at her insight. Indeed, I had owned the lake the entire time, yet I had never barred access. The purpose had never been control. It had always been stewardship, care, protection. My grandfather had said it best: "You can't own something you love. You just take care of it so it can outlive you." Tom joined us later, still in uniform but relaxed, handing me a coffee and sitting beside me on the railing. He asked what came next, and I gestured to the freshly installed wooden sign that read, "Lake Sanders. Welcome neighbors. Respect the water. Respect each other. No HOA. No nonsense." The simplicity of it made him grin. Politics? No, I told him. This lake didn't need a clipboard. Even Sophie had attempted one last futile strike. The state office called that morning to confirm her appeal had been denied. Her evidence consisted of memes printed from Facebook. My laughter rang across the empty dock, echoing over the calm water. She was still fighting ghosts, still trying to conjure control from shadows. And still she lost. The sun dipped low, honeyed and rich, casting the lake in molten light. Boats drifted lazily, children waved, and the lake thrummed with life, entirely free. That evening, neighbors returned, lanterns in hand, setting them adrift across the shimmering surface. Linda's voice, soft and untamed, carried across the water without microphone or amplification, blending with crickets and gentle waves. Peace didn't need noise, it only needed presence. Tom leaned close, half teasing, half serious. "A local legend," he said, "the man who evicted the HOA. But I knew better. It wasn't about fame. It was about legacy, justice, and care." The lanterns drifted across the water, reflecting like trembling hearts, and in their glow, I felt the weight of months of tension lift entirely. When the last lantern flickered and the echoes of laughter faded, I returned to the cabin. On my desk sat the old deed behind glass, alongside my grandfather's photograph, knees in water, fishing rod in hand, half smiling at the world. I touched the frame softly and whispered, "We kept it safe, old man." The floorboards creaked with life as I sat down to write. Not the headlines, not the viral clips, not the stories the world demanded, but the truth. A lake is more than water. It is memory, law, patience, and respect. Power without integrity is noise, and noise always fades. Somewhere out there, Sophie Ward was likely drafting her next complaint, another illusion of control, yet it was meaningless. The lake didn't care. It belonged to no one and everyone at once. That was the real victory. Not overturned fines. Not dismissed lawsuits. Not even the eviction. The real triumph was a community learning how to live again. Free from fear, free to reclaim joy, free to remember peace. I drew a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, and whispered it aloud to the stars, to the lake, to my grandfather. Freedom isn't about owning water. It's about keeping it clear. Somewhere beneath the surface, the water shimmered, answering silently. The lake knew. It always had. Sometimes, the loudest voices mistake noise for power. But true strength is quiet, patient, persistent. It waits. It stands. It endures. This wasn't just about an HOA or a lake. It was about boundaries. About knowing where yours begin and where someone else's end. About standing firm, unshaken, without yelling, without needing validation. And for anyone who has ever faced their own Sophie Ward, someone who pushes too far, who mistakes authority for ownership, the lesson is clear. The truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to wait for the tide to turn. Somewhere in the dark, beneath the lake's calm surface, it whispered back. And those who listened understood. Patience is power, and respect, once lost, can always be reclaimed. The lake was quiet now, truly quiet, and yet it hummed with life, memory, and the subtle, enduring magic of justice fulfilled. The final curtain had fallen, but its echo would ripple forever.